Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so excited that so many of you could join us today for Finding Self-Compassion. I'm Alex Elliott, the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. Before we start, I want to go over a few things. We will have a Q&A after the conversation this evening. Please submit your questions at any time in the YouTube chat. Our presenters will pull from those questions at the end, and we will try to get through as many as we can. If you have any technical issues, that's also how to reach us, is in that YouTube chat. So you can post there, and we will do our best to get you back up and running. Now, let me introduce our presenters, Kendra Diaz-Ford and Marianne Ingheim, and then we'll get right into the conversation. Kendra Diaz-Ford is Program Director and Assistant Professor in the Integral and Transpersonal Psychology program here at CIS. She comes from years of professional experience deeply rooted in the field of mental health, which included casework, housing advocacy, and social activism. Scholarly and research interests include the effects of mind-body medicine on well-being, spiritualized feminism as transformative activism, self-authoring spirituality, embodied ways of knowing, intersections of transpersonal psychology and women's spiritual development, women's stories, critical thinking in psychology, grounded theory, and qualitative research methods as transformative ways of knowing. Marianne Ingheim is a Danish-Norwegian-American writer and PhD student in transformative studies at California Institute of Integral Studies. She is the author of the award-winning book, Out of Love, Finding Your Way Back to Self-Compassion, published by She Writes Press in May of 2020. In her book, she describes how the practice of self-compassion transformed her life and helped her to cope with cancer and suicide loss. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Kendra and Marianne.
Thank you so much, Alex, for that introduction. Marianne, it's really wonderful to be here with you this evening.
It's so great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you and on this topic of self-compassion and to learn more about you and the book that you wrote and to just be engaged in this dialogue around this topic.
It's one of my favorite topics.
Wonderful. So I was just wondering, just to kind of start us off for this evening in our conversation, just to get kind of a feel around, what is self-compassion? How do you define self-compassion in your own life and perhaps, in how you've defined it also in your book?
Yeah. So self-compassion is similar to the construct of compassion, which means literally to suffer with and to want to alleviate that suffering. And self-compassion is that feeling turned inwards. The researcher, Kristen Neff, who by the way was at CIIS a year ago, I believe, for public programs, she defines self-compassion as containing 3 elements. So self-kindness, mindfulness, and common humanity. And self-kindness means being kind to yourself rather than harsh and judgmental. So it has to do with how we talk to ourselves, how we take care of ourselves. Mindfulness is a balanced awareness that neither rejects or over-identifies with. And then common humanity is recognizing that we are connected through our shared humanity and that suffering is simply part of being human. Paul Gilbert, who's another compassion researcher, he says, we didn't choose to be born. We just kind of find ourselves here with our complicated brains doing the best we can. So, and there are lots of misconceptions about self-compassion. One of them is that it will make us lazy and unmotivated, which is not true. The research shows that it's compassion and not criticism that motivates us to do better, which is counterintuitive. You know, one of the reasons why we think we need to be self-critical is that if we're not, we will be unsuccessful. We won't do what we're supposed to be doing. So
I like having that definition of self-compassion sort of broken down into these three parts of kindness and mindfulness and shared humanity. It kind of helps create a more holistic understanding of what it is, because when you hear self-compassion, it can have so many different meanings or feel like it's hard to kind of grasp. But the way you've defined it really feels like I can kind of land into self-compassion and how you understand it. I'm
right.
really curious about how you actually came to self-compassion. What brought you to even care about this topic or to integrate it into your life in the way that you have?
Yeah. So I came to it through the work of Kristen Neff. And so let me start by saying that I grew up learning, as I think most of us do, to be self-critical. And in my case, I grew up in a very fundamentalist Christian family. And so there was a lot of shaming, and I felt like I was fundamentally flawed. There was something inherently wrong with me. And so I grew up with this harsh inner critic. And I just thought that was normal, right? I didn't know any other way. So when I read Kristen Neff's book, it kind of shocked me. Like, really? There's another way I could actually be kind to myself? And so then I read other books, Paul Gilbert, Tara Brach, Brene Brown, and I was understanding intellectually this concept, but I hadn't yet made the leap to putting it into practice. I don't know if that's one of my academic flaws, is that I'll grasp something, but actually putting it into practice is a completely different animal. So for me, what sort of propelled me into practicing self-compassion was some events that happened in 2016 and 2017, which was sort of the impetus for writing the book. And so in August of 2016, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And actually exactly 4 years ago, I had a double mastectomy. And, the thing about illness is you have a lot of time to reflect. And for me, it was a time of it was a wake-up call, is what it was. It was a wake-up call. And like my life was asking, am I living the life I feel I was meant to live? Am I fulfilling my purpose here on earth? And the answer was no. I was living a small life. This is what self-criticism had done for me. I was afraid of doing anything. And one of the problems was I was married to a man who was very critical. And I realized that I needed out, which was a really difficult decision because we'd been married for almost 10 years. Eventually, though, it felt like the self-compassionate thing for me was to leave. And with the help of a therapist, I finally told him. I had agonized about telling him for months, because I was worried that it would break his heart.
Mm-hmm.
And it's strange, but I've told this story quite a few times now, and it doesn't get easier to talk about it.
Yeah, I can hear some of the emotion in your voice. So, thank you for being willing to even just, speak about it, in this moment.
Yeah, well, it's important. So my first husband, then he walked out of the therapy session, and I didn't see him again. Later that night, I got a call from the sheriff's department that there'd been a car crash in West Oakland, and he had died instantly. And the next day, I went to our apartment and found a suicide note and 2 Google Map printouts of the crash site. So it was clearly intentional. And, I want to just a little sidebar here. September is Suicide Prevention Month. And if there's anything that people can take from this tonight, I want it to be that it's self-compassionate to ask for help.
Mm.
And whether that is that you have suffered a suicide loss or that you are having suicidal thoughts, there is so much help out there. And just ask for help, And if you've experienced suicide loss, I recommend joining a group specifically for suicide loss, because other bereavement groups are great, but suicide is its own complex trauma.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that was one of the first things I did, was join a support group. And then the question became, well, how am I going to move on from this? Because I blamed myself big time. I mean, how could I not blame myself? And it took a lot of self-care and self-compassion to get sort of to the other side. Yeah. So that's how I came to self-compassion.
Well, yeah, it sounds like it really was something that, in coming to this decision, it's like you really had to understand your life from a different lens, right? Because you mentioned sort of having this critical lens, and it, not that it's like it required this kind of wake-up call. I mean, it's quite intense what you've had to go through in order to come to this point. Of course, I liked what you said is around at the beginning around that we don't necessarily choose to come here, but then we find ourselves, here with all of these complexities. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it's like that was seemed like that was a really big turning point for you to have those experiences and so close together.
Right. So it was in the course of 6 months, mm-hmm. From August of 2016 to February of 2017. Mm-hmm. It was very intense. And at the same time, I learned so much about myself, and that I was kind of forced to take care of myself. Mm-hmm. And being forced to do that, I showed up for myself, and I showed myself that I can take care of myself. Mm-hmm. And after that, there was like nothing I couldn't do. So one of the first things I started was a PhD program. So it definitely changed a lot for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What were some, I just get curious, when I hear you say that, it's like, what was one of the first things that you felt like you could really step into, as you're making this shift in how you're being in the world, what felt like the most, I guess, tangible step that you could take to then, move into this deeper, or more expanded state that you're speaking about?
That's a really good question. In the beginning, it was all about self-care. I mean, there's like this foggy state that accompanies grief,
Mm-hmm.
and all I could do was take care of my physical needs. Was I eating and sleeping? In some ways, it's similar to what we're going through on a collective level with COVID.
Mm-hmm.
In the beginning, it felt like all we could do was just get through the day. And then there comes a point where you have to make meaning of it. Or at least that's how it was for me. What story was I gonna tell about this? How was I gonna make sense of it? And I think we all tell stories about
Mm-hmm.
what happens. And when trauma happens, we need to find a way to fit it into our life story.
Mm-hmm.
It's like our life story has been jarred, and how's this piece gonna fit in with who we are? And that takes time. For me, a lot of it has to do with journaling. I just journaled a lot, and that's also partly why I have so many journaling prompts in the book, because
Mm-hmm.
I felt for me it's been so helpful. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. I think that the journaling piece seems like that's really prevalent. And I really
Mhm.
like, just, since you mentioned your book, how you've so beautifully interwoven, bits of your story, and, how you came to make some shifts. And then you turn it around and offer like a gift. It's almost like a gift that you then give to the reader, in
Mhm.
offering them, a prompt or some way to engage in that concept. And I just, I really love how you interweave all of these components into your book. But I want to go back to the idea of story, because that's something that is really intriguing to me, the way in which we write our stories in our own minds about who we are in
Mhm.
the world, and how sometimes we can get caught up in a story that perhaps isn't serving. And you mentioned stories a few times, or throughout your book, around the importance of that. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more, around the importance of, the stories that we tell ourselves, and how this has been also a component for you in your journey in self-compassion.
Yeah. So the form that our self-criticism takes is often story. And so we can get caught in these core narratives that are limiting. And I certainly had done that. I had bought into the story that I was never going to be good enough, no matter how much I people pleased or achieved, or did things as perfectly as I could. It was just never going to be good enough. And these stories, we get them from our primary caregivers, our early environments, church, school, parents. And, you know, it's not our fault that we believe them. That's all we've heard. But at some point, it's like, okay, I need to choose my story now. Do I still want to believe this story? Is the story from the church, is that the story I want to live by? Is it the story that my husband's suicide was my fault? Is that a beneficial story? I mean, whether or not it's true, you know, it's not going to help anyone to be living by that story. So I did a lot of journaling around what was I telling myself about who I am and my place in the world and what I could and could not do. And, you know, these stories, they impact how we deal with future events. You know, there's a advantage or an opportunity in a traumatic event. You are faced with your stories. It comes to the surface in a way that, you know, normally you might be unconscious of these stories. And so trauma can be an opportunity to look at them and uncover them and rewrite them to be more self-compassionate.
Right. Do you think that is, I'm just, you know, to stay with this a little bit, because I have my own idea around that, you know, in that, you know, trauma is something that in many ways it breaks us open. Right. And when that breaking open happens, it's like we see more of ourselves. Right. Is that kind of what you're alluding to? Or is there something more to it?
Well, for me anyway, it's easy to get wrapped up in your daily life and not self-reflect until one day you wake up and you're like, wow, I'm here. Is this where I wanted to be going? And so this might be a good time to distinguish between self-criticism and self-reflection.
Yeah.
So it's important to be self-reflective, to look at yourself. And that's different from self-criticism.
Yeah, you write about this a little bit in your book around how you can, when you are journaling, how you can kind of get yourself into this more critical kind of loop or way of writing, rather than, you know, letting that just kind of be a part of the journaling and then moving into a more self-compassionate way.
Right.
Yeah.
And also that, you know, I love journaling and I talk about it all the time, but there's one trap you can get stuck in, which is it just becomes a negative rant. And it's like going to the deeper level. What else is there? And how can I turn this into something positive or growth oriented or something that I can learn from?
And how would you say, you know, how can you get to that deeper level? How can, you know, just for folks who are listening, just curious if you might offer a suggestion around how somebody can go from, you know, writing in a more sort of negative way in their journaling to really making that shift to dropping into a deeper space within themselves to really reach into, you know, this more self-reflective or self-compassionate way of journaling.
So for me, one of the things I practice is rereading what I've written and noticing what patterns there are. And a lot of times different books will have journaling prompts that just get me into the right space. Sometimes rereading what I wrote and reflecting back on it, like writing about what I notice in my patterns. You know, the first step of anything is becoming aware. A lot of times we're not even aware of how negative we are. And so just rereading it, it kind of hits you. And yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, it does. I think what I'm hearing you say is like, it's kind of slowing the process down a little bit and just giving space to really look at what's really happening. What are you communicating through your words, and to see the patterns. I think that, you answered that really clearly, and it seems like a really useful process to engage in, because, I think when I think about journaling, it's like I've written it in the journal, and then I turn the page and I don't ever come back to it. And so I think what you're offering is a really, it's an additional step in the practice of journaling that feels really important, to be able to notice and to see the patterns that are happening.
Yeah.
One of the practices that I noticed you wrote about was the practice of gratitude. And I thought it was really interesting the way you framed the practice of journaling, in gratitude. And I wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit about that and how that relates to, what we're talking about this evening.
Yeah. So it's a journaling practice that, I don't remember where I got it from, honestly. I I read so many books, but I didn't come up with it myself. So the idea is that first you write about what you're grateful for. And then you write about what you wish would happen, but as if it had happened. And so it's like it's another layer of you're being grateful for what will happen. I'm trying to say this. And the fascinating thing about it was that I practiced this for a while, and the thing that I was wanting came true. So be careful what you wish for, right? And so it's just it's coming at it from gratitude instead of, okay, I'm going to visualize what I want. And I just felt like coming from that perspective, it was it was a deepening process for me, and writing it down certainly makes it more real.
Yeah. And writing, I noticed, you spoke about writing about it in as if it's already happened. And there seemed to be an importance around that piece, around it, not something that you're wishing for, but something that's already here, present, and now.
Right. It makes it very immediate and achievable.
Yeah. So I'm you mentioned earlier in the conversation around you joining, building up the confidence and to join the PhD program. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about, what you're doing in the PhD program, what your research, looks like, and just to speak a little bit about that experience.
Yeah. Well, so I'm very interested in how we make meaning after a traumatic event. What stories do people tend to tell after such an event, and what kinds of stories are most beneficial for growth? And so I'm combining this interest in meaning and story with self-compassion.
Mm.
So how can we use a self-compassion narrative to create growth-oriented meaning? Because that's ultimately what helped me, and I think in some ways my book is the expression of a self-compassion narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm looking at in my research is coming up with a framework for this self-compassion narrative. So I'm taking Kristen Neff's definition with the 3 elements: self-kindness, mindfulness, and common humanity. And then I'm adding to it, because I feel like those 3 are the sort of the acceptance piece.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's the being in what is. And then I'm adding sort of the narrative part with something that's pragmatic, useful, and has agency, and is growth oriented. And so that's the potential for change.
Mm-hmm.
So how can I be with what is and also create the change that I want? Because ultimately, I think that's what's so fascinating about adversity, is that people survive and cope and thrive afterwards. And how does that happen?
Mm-hmm.
How do people create something beautiful out of something horrible?
Right.
I'm really interested in that. So,
Yeah.
and I think self-compassion can be a really key element to give us the courage to do this, because it takes courage. And really, I think that that's the biggest difference for me. I always wanted to be brave and do stuff, but I didn't have the compassion for myself. And so when I failed at it, my self-worth fell apart. With self-compassion, it's like, okay, I can make a mistake. I'm still okay.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've got me no matter what. This is one of the biggest differences between self-compassion and self-esteem. Originally, Kristen Neff had proposed self-compassion as an alternative to self-esteem, because self-esteem has a dark side. And the biggest difference is that self-esteem is attached to outcomes. You know, as long as
Mm-hmm.
you're doing well, then you're going to feel good about yourself. But when you fail, as we all eventually do, then the self-worth falls apart. Self-esteem, or with self-compassion, you're always okay. It's not contingent on how well you perform,
Mm-hmm.
or, you know, if people like you or don't like you. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that self-compassion is not conditional on
Right.
you know, what you do or what happens. It's like it's like your best friend that's always there with
Mhm.
you know, helping you through the good times and the bad times, you know.
And that's so empowering, to know that that you've got you,
Mm-hmm.
even if the world around you is falling apart, you know. And I do realize when I say that I'm saying it from a place of a lot of privilege, you know.
Yeah.
And so I recognize that this is not this does not change the fact that there are systemic things that need to be changed,
Mm-hmm.
you know. um yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're certainly seeing, you know, some of that with the current pandemic and you know, the civic upheaval that's happening right now too, you know, here in the United States. I mean, there's a lot happening that's being brought to the surface. and I'm certainly not going to ask you to come up with an answer to all of those.
Good.
That would be a lot to sort of hand over, but I do, just get curious. I mean, it's like right now, it's like, there is a way in which, regardless of circumstances, we're going through a shared experience.
Mm-hmm.
How the shared experience is affecting us is entirely unique to our context, who we are, and our communities, our social worlds. I mean, there's so many different layers to it.
Right.
And at the core, I mean, one of the things that I hear in the definition that you use is humanity, right? It's like we all have this, we all are part of the shared humanity together. And so, I guess the question that's really coming up for me is, how even during this time of pandemic where things are really challenging, how we can, like, how important self-compassion is at this particular time and this particular moment.
Right. Right. Well, as I think I started to say earlier, in the beginning of this pandemic, and I'm not in any way badly affected by it, but we're all in some way affected, right? And in the beginning, there was this sense of needing to hunker down and take care of myself,
Mm-hmm.
because the whole world just felt like it was falling apart. Now I feel like I'm coming out of that bubble maybe a little bit, and okay, what now? We're still in it, and what can we learn from this experience? Let's not let this pass and go back to normal, whatever
Mm-hmm.
normal was before.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to tell a new story, write a new story. And I mean, obviously, one of the biggest things I think we've noticed is how interconnected we are.
Mm-hmm.
One person's behavior here affects all these people. So I hope that this will be an opportunity for us to find a better way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I hope so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that. I really appreciate, your framing of that. And, I think one of the things that you pointed to was around, just I guess the privilege, that you have. And, I know that you've just recently published your book during this time. So it was like, I just wondering if you could speak a little bit about what it was even like to write a book during this time, to publish a book during this time.
It felt selfish. It was really hard to market my book during, like, here, buy my book. It just felt like such a small thing compared to people dying.
Mm-hmm.
But then I reframed it as like, okay, I have something to offer.
Yeah.
Someone might be needing to read this.
Yeah.
And, of course, I couldn't do the book readings. I can't talk to you in person.
Although this is a wonderful alternative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is, I had a virtual book launch, and I was able to have some friends from Denmark be with me. That wouldn't have happened in a normal setting. So, everything has its pluses and minuses. I'm still hoping one day to have a book reading in a bookstore. Maybe that'll happen.
Yeah.
In a year or something. Yeah. But so that was also an example of reframing a situation where I could feel incredibly sorry for myself. Here I've been working on this book, and now what?
Yeah. Yeah. I like one thing that you're kind of alluding to that I'm hearing you say, and I think you talk about this a little bit in your book too, or at several different points, is around, sometimes when you publish something or you do a study or, you're speaking about a particular topic, I think sometimes there's this sense that, everybody thinks like, oh, well, so you've perfected it. Like, you know how to do this well all the time, right? You're just 100% self-compassionate. And I think what you've just mentioned is that like it's a practice, right? So it just, wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I like to say that I'm not an expert on self-compassion. I'm an expert on self-criticism. And it is a practice, a constant, I'm, it's never going to be something that I can just check off as, okay, self-compassion, I've done that. No, it's a constant, I don't want to use the word struggle. I want to say challenge. It's a decision I have to make every day, a conscious choice, because my tendency is automatically to go to criticism, to perfectionism, comparison, beating myself up for not achieving enough. I think we all have our various, our inner critic can take different shapes for different people.
Yeah.
And for me, it definitely goes into that perfectionism achievement trap and worry trap. That's another good one. So yeah, I'm going to be practicing this for the rest of my life.
That's really good modeling too, When you say you make a conscious choice, is it like you kind of wake up and you say, today I'm going to be self-compassionate? Or is it like something that just, it's like now, now it's just kind of more of, the way in which you engage in the world?
Well, so on the one hand, when it comes to self-talk, a lot of times, honestly, it's my husband. He'll say, hey, that wasn't very self-compassionate. And so it's catching myself or him catching me saying something, and okay, how can I reframe that? But then on a bigger scale, self-compassion, I think, is about the decisions and behaviors and choices we make, which will be different for different people, So, for example, for some people, having a glass of wine is a compassionate thing to do. Sit and have it. For me, no, it's not. I can't do that. So it's those are also part of self-compassion. It's both taking care of yourself, bubble baths or whatever, and it's also, am I living in alignment with who I want to be?
Yeah. So it's not like there's this like set formula, like this is what self-compassion looks like. I mean, in some sense, yes, right? There's sort of like there's elements to it that you've already beautifully described. And it seems like it's really unique and to each individual. It's based in, who they are as authentic beings.
Yeah. And this was part of why I really wanted to make this book an offering for the reader to discover their truth, their story. That's why I have all these journaling prompts, because I'm sharing my story as this is what worked for me. But ultimately, I think each of us is an expert on ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And no one else can come in and say, this is what you need to do. This is how you need to live. I did that for many years, and it does not work.
Mm-hmm.
A big part of my self-compassion shift was looking to myself for the answers instead of to others, whether it was the church or some boyfriend or whatever. Finding the answers within yourself is super important.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why this self-reflection piece is really important, which is not the same as self-criticism. Like, we can reflect on, okay, that was kind of, I didn't do that so well, but that doesn't mean I'm beating myself up. I'm a horrible person. You know what I mean? Like, we can.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think, it's like, if we can be curious, in that self-reflective process, if we can be curious about what happened or be open, it's like, without attributing any sort of like, this is wrong or right, or any sort of judgment to it, is what kind of releases some of that grip of the self-criticism in that process.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then that seems like that gives the opportunity. It's like, that's where the doorway opens to rewrite the story or to step into self-compassion. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I was actually just looking at your website right before this, and I saw you have the words radical self-authorship. And I love that. I just wanted to tell you, I really love that phrase.
Oh,
I'm
thank you.
Steal it. No.
Well, you're welcome to. I mean, it's self-authoring is, I think, it's what you've been talking about this whole time. It's about making these conscious choices around who we are in the world. And I think, I love that you've really framed it through the lens of self-compassion, because I think that we do have a tendency to be much more self-critical about who we are. I mean, how it's like, I've often heard the phrase, like, if you said that to a friend, would you ever say the things that you say to yourself to one of your best friends? And a lot of us would
Right.
probably say no, because that's really mean.
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen this French Dove commercial. It's been circulating around for quite a few years. But they did this experiment where they asked some women to write down their random thoughts about themselves throughout the day. And then those lines were given to some actresses. And then they all met in a coffee shop, and these actresses spoke these lines to each other while the original women were listening. And they said, that's really horrible what you're saying to that person. And it was the same words that they had said to themselves, right?
Yeah.
So it's amazing. And when you believe those words, it keeps you from living your best life.
Yeah. Which it sounds like, from just what you kind of started out saying when we started our conversation around, how it was almost like once you stepped into self-compassion, it was like you could do anything. It's like it released you from something.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was also, I want to say, a shift in mindset. And I'm not sure, I think that kind of happened gradually, leaving sort of this fundamentalist way of thinking where everything was right or wrong, you were good or bad, to a more flexible, pragmatic, maybe, way of thinking. Not that there aren't facts, but that just asking this question, is this a beneficial story for me to be telling? And when I say story, I don't mean that there aren't facts. There are facts. We're we need facts more now than ever. So that's not what I'm saying, but in interpreting the facts, we're telling a story, and that's where we can decide how do we want to tell that story.
Yeah. So, I guess when you're talking about stories, since you just alluded to that a little bit, do you want to elaborate a little bit about what you mean by story?
And it's a
And
good question.
Yeah, I guess in how just in how it relates to what we've been talking about with self-compassion and the stories that we tell, what you mean by that, I guess, a little bit more.
So I think I mean two different things. So on the one hand, you have sort of the narrative you tell to make sense of a specific event. So this thing happened and you tell a story about it. And then on the deeper level, you have sort of the core narratives, the life story of your life. So you have the little story and the big story. And the little stories need to fit into this big story somehow in order for you to feel like you have a coherent identity, maybe.
Yeah.
I haven't really thought about how I want to define that. That's a very good question.
Yeah. I mean, I think you defined it really, really well. And I guess that's something that you'll probably, work on, conceptualizing a little bit more when it gets to, when you start to work on your research more deeply and really get into those concepts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just curious, if there's something about just the process of writing the book, and what that was like, just sort of in a self-compassionate way, like what that was like to even write the book from this frame of being critical around, because I guess what I'm trying to say is like you speak so honestly about your experiences in your book, which I think is it's a way of opening up the reader into your own life. Like you mentioned, it's like, this has been my experience and this is what the turning points that happened for me, and then here's an offering for you. And I get curious about what was that like for you to even to make those choices around what you decided to share in your book.
Well, okay, I want to see right now. I'm wanting to say three things at the same time. Got to choose one. First, a little bit about creativity, because that is really hard to do when you have your inner critic on you. If there's anything that needs the inner critic to go away, that's creativity. And so even just getting to where I could write anything at all. I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on here. Anne Lamott, she talks about writing a shitty first draft. And that is super, super important. Just to write out whatever, and then I will figure out later on, am I going to keep this or not keep it? Am I going to, maybe shape it differently? To allow myself to just be messy on the page. And then, but I do have a chapter in here where I talk about a writing retreat that didn't go so well because I didn't do any writing, and my inner critic was having a field day with that. You need to be writing, and then it's like the irony, I'm writing a book on self-compassion and my inner critic is beating me up about not doing my writing. So and as far as like what I chose to put in there, I'm really pretty transparent. So as far as the one thing I did not want to mention names, And so, except for my husband, my current husband, I did not use anyone's name. So I tried to be as careful of people's privacy as I could.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as my own privacy, I'm not particularly worried about what people think of me.
Yeah. Which I think really demonstrates, the self-compassion, what you're talking about around not having this fear around who you are in the world.
Mhm.
I feel like that's how you frame it. Self-compassion doesn't have to be something that we're just sort of sitting, in a meditation room and sort of, practicing self-compassion. It's less about, while it includes the sort of the inner looking, what I've really sort of gathered from our talk today, and even just, reading your book, is that it really is about being action in the world too. It's sort of like that both and.
Right. And that, I feel, is the biggest change, perhaps, that self-compassion has given me the courage to do the things that I'm scared of doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Self-compassion to courage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, this has been really lovely to have this time to speak with you one-on-one, and I'd like to open it up to the audience for some Q&A, if that's okay with you, Marianne, to make that transition.
Sure.
Okay. So the first question for today is from Joe Jackson. And Joe asks, do you see a connection to self-compassion and compassionate action?
Yes. I feel like there is, well, let me clarify that the research does not actually show whether there's a connection between self-compassion and compassion. That self-compassionate people are more compassionate or vice versa. But in my own experience, I feel that having the compassion for yourself first is the place from which you can show up in the world and act compassionately. And because you have that recognition of the shared common humanity, for me anyway, it feels more important to have compassion for other people because I'm seeing us all as interconnected.
Thank you. The next question is from Kit. Was it necessary for you to distance yourself from critical people in your life in order to develop self-compassion?
Yes. And that was part of the reason why I needed to leave my first husband. He was a very critical person, and it's interesting, we choose these people because that's what we're used to. I had a very critical grandmother. I loved her dearly, but she was not a nice person. And so I was used to choosing people who were critical. At some point, though, I needed to choose who do I want to spend my time and energy with. And it's hard when it's family members. There are some family members that don't talk to me anymore because of this book. And that's kind of just that's just how it's gone. For me, it's more important for me to show up as myself than to placate others, even family members.
Mm-hmm.
but it's an individual decision. It really is. I can't say this is how everyone should do it. This is just what was right for me.
Mm-hmm.
We do get to choose, though, who we spend our time with. Sometimes we think that, we're just forced to be with whoever, but we have a choice.
Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of reminded me a little bit, just your answer to that question around the importance of being authentic, and how authenticity sometimes it can land differently with different people in our lives.
Right. And it's hard, especially when you're talking about family members.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it's your life. It's your one precious life, as Mary Oliver says. And what are you going to do with it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So the next question, Marianne, is from Sophia. How do they think men can start practicing self-compassion, especially in the context of the patriarchy, where the male energy has gotten unbalanced and rigid?
So is the question how men can practice it or how women can practice it, given that?
How do you, I think it's from how men can start to practice self-compassion, especially, sort of within this context of patriarchy, where there's a, defined way of being that Sophia describes as unbalanced and rigid.
Yeah. I think that it can be difficult, perhaps, for some men to be self-compassionate. Like, that's a soft, there's this macho attitude that we have to, self-compassion is, and I seem to remember that Kristen Neff talked about having brought this to some veterans where she called it something else. She didn't call it self-compassion. She called it something else that was more palatable to the macho. But, we all need self-compassion. And men are self-critical too.
Mm-hmm.
The women might be slightly more self-critical, but as far as the patriarchy, I'm trying to think how to address that.
Well, would you say, that men and women's, that we, as you've mentioned, that we both need self-compassion, that all, but that how we enter in self-compassion is would be the same or would be different? I mean, regardless of who we are, what paradigm is.
I think that for women, we might have more of a resistance to self-compassion simply because we are caregivers. And so it's so natural for us to give, but to see ourselves as receiving can be tricky.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just how our roles have been for many years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Let's move on to the next one. There's a few more questions here that I think would be really great for us to get to. Amir asks, do you have a suggestion for avoiding the cycle of compare and despair? Either comparing myself to others or to my future, some more successful self.
Yeah. Comparison is one of the inner critic's favorite tricks. We compare ourselves to others because we want to belong. We want to fit in. We don't want to be rejected. And was the question how we can counter that?
Yeah, how to avoid the cycle of compare and despair.
Yeah. Well, from the self-compassionate perspective, I would remind myself that of our common humanity, you know, that we're all just doing the best we can. And none of us is perfect. There's really no, you know, for a long time, I compared myself with my sister, who, bless her heart, is much more straight and narrow, where I'm like all curvy all over the place. And so I've compared myself with her a lot. And why can't I just be more like her and have everything figured out? And, you know, we're each on the path we need to be on. And there are no mistakes. There's just different paths. And so I've learned to, I mean, I still compare myself with her sometimes, but to own who I am. And then I think he mentioned also comparing himself to a future.
Yeah, to a
self,
future
right?
self or an imagine. Yeah. So the question is, yeah, the second part is either comparing myself to others or to my future, more successful self.
I don't really know what to say about that second part. But as far as comparing to others, it's a trap. And, you know, we're all doing it, but it's a trap. I try to tell myself, I'm here to be the best me that I can be, and trying to be anyone else is futile.
Indeed. Yes,
So
hence
we
why.
still try, but
Yes, it's like I was, hence why it's a practice, right? It's just have to keep
yeah.
coming back to it, keep coming back to it. Yeah. This next question is from Kara, and Kara asks, how do you rewrite your story?
That is a good question. So, the first step is becoming aware of what story you're telling yourself. And, this can be done through different journaling exercises. And then rereading what you've written to notice the patterns. And once you're conscious of what story you're telling yourself, asking yourself if that is a beneficial story, if that is a story you want to keep living by. And the rewriting, it's not as simple as writing a book. Not that writing a book is simple, but it's again a long process of gradually rewriting bits and pieces of it. Starting with, how do I talk to myself on a daily basis? Like, if my story is, I'm never going to be good enough, catching all the times throughout the day that I'm telling pieces of that story to myself and reframing it. I'm curious what you would say to that, Kendra.
To how to rewrite your story?
Yeah, with your radical.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of what you've reflected upon are elements. I mean, I think that the way in which we rewrite our stories, we first have to become aware of what is the story that we're telling ourselves. And then to really look at what are the parts. It's a conscious action. It's conscious choice making. And it's an active process. And I agree with you that it's something that happens gradually. I mean, I think that there's parts of ourselves that can automatically, it's almost like they automatically get rewritten because of an experience that we've had.
Right.
And then there's elements of it that need time and reflection and unhooking. It's almost like unweaving a fabric so that we can look at each of the individual threads, so that we can decide what threads we're going to leave off and what threads we're going to reweave into the next, fabric.
Right. And it's a continual process, because just because we've written something one way doesn't mean it's going to be that way
Right.
forever, New things, life keeps happening.
Yes.
And so in light of the new things that happen, the past looks different. So the past continues to be rewritten also.
Yeah. That's a really important point. Yeah. I see that there's one more question for this evening. Are you okay to do one more question? Okay. Akiko asks, my fear of practicing compassion with myself and others is being too compassionate. I come from a place of having boundaries crossed, so I've become more rigid. Is that a fine line, and how to navigate?
Well, when we've had that experience of having our boundaries crossed, we put up our walls, as we should. And so how do we, and in fact, that's a very self-compassionate thing to do, to have your boundaries with other people. So if other people have crossed those, it is practicing compassion for yourself to set those boundaries. So then, maybe you want to open up a little bit. For me personally, I have had to look at the various people. Some people, there's just no way I can have a healthy relationship with that person. But with other people, I can loosen up a little bit and I can be more vulnerable. So it depends on the person and your history with the person. Is that answering the question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's just, and also, is there a fine, what's the fine line between being too compassionate and self-compassionate, or is there a fine line?
I don't know that you can be too compassionate. There is such a thing as compassion fatigue. But I think that's different. Really, that's about, are you also taking care of yourself? Or are you only taking care of other people and not taking care of yourself? There needs to be a balance there between the time you spend taking care of others and taking care of yourself. And actually taking care of yourself first. Because otherwise you don't have the resources to take care of anyone else.
And that seems like the self-compassionate act. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you, Marianne, and thank the audience too for all of your wonderful questions. This has really been a lovely way to spend the evening with you, Marianne, and to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so I'll hand it back over to Alex.
Thank you so much to both of our presenters, and also to all of you for attending this evening. We hope that you will join us for more of our upcoming talks and workshops. As a thank you for joining us tonight, we are offering you $10 off our workshop, Self-Care for Highly Sensitive People, with Elaine Aaron and Elaine Freund on October 24th through 25th, using the code HSP20. And we've posted that link in the chat if you want to learn more. This conversation was recorded tonight, so if you would like to watch it again or share it with your community, it can be found at this same link on YouTube or later on our Facebook page. We will also feature this talk on our podcast, which you can find at ciispod.com or by searching CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. Thank you again for joining us this evening and have a great night.